Welcome to our talk, Got Mold? How Our Homes Impact Our Health. Next slide. Now I'll introduce today's speaker. Michael Rubino is a certified microbial remediation supervisor, the highest certification for microbial remediation at the American Council for Accredited Certification, requiring 10 years of documented field experience. He has founded Home Cleanse, an organization dedicated to bringing the gap between our health and our homes. Finally, he is co-founder and the chair of Change the Air Foundation, with a personal mission of helping 100 million people end all suffering from environmental exposures by the year 2030. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for presenting for us today. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. And without further ado, I will share my screen. All right. So as mentioned, the title of this is Got Mold, How Our Homes Impact Our Health. This is a very high level, and so I'm sure we'll get into a little more nitty-gritty details on the Q&A. As mentioned, my name is Michael Rubino. I'm co-founder and chair of Change the Air Foundation, which is a nonprofit giving every person the knowledge, resources, and support to achieve better health by breathing safe indoor air. We have a situation here where we have never been sicker, and the prevalence of mold in buildings is widespread. In a major cross-sectional study conducted by the US EPA and HUD, we have 85% of buildings have past water damage. The Occupational and Safety Health Administration estimates that 25% of homes have had enough water damage to host toxigenic molds. So it's these numbers would be conservative to say the least, but it's the problem of prevalence in mold, especially within North America. You're going to see that it's not getting better. When we look at health, we want to look at this pie chart here. And, the reason we look at this is because there are things like epigenetics, genetics, exercise, the quality of water we drink, frequency of water we drink, our diets. But, one of the things that many people do not think about at all is the quality of air that they're actually breathing. If you didn't know already, the average person takes about 20,000 breaths per day. The World Health Organization estimates that 9 out of 10 people do not breathe clean air. The EPA suggests the average person spends 90% of their time indoors, especially post-COVID. So what are things that impact the quality of air that we're breathing? Well, we have things like VOCs and off-gassing. We have electromagnetic fields and radiation, things like formaldehyde, radon, which if a recent study just came out saying that it's one of the largest leading causes of cancer outside of smoking, household chemicals, and then water damage, which would include things like mold and bacteria. So how do we hack our air quality? How do we consciously make improvements to the quality of air that we're breathing? We want to use things like low VOC alternatives for paints. If you think about the amount of surface area that paints cover the entire interior surface of the walls and ceilings, it's a lot. The other alternative for low VOC products, formaldehyde-free products, things of that nature would be flooring. The amount of flooring that covers, the inside space is astronomical. Ensuring that your home's electrical is well grounded and not creating any EMFs. This is, I think, very key, especially when you get into things like major appliances, the modern refrigerator, these nice built-in ones that have all of these different apparatuses, making sure that condensers are properly set up, properly grounded. We've seen a lot of nightmares here with EMFs just in that alone. Things like furniture sponges, other manufactured products don't contain formaldehyde, where we want to, just like when we're being conscious about things like PFAS, we want to add formaldehyde to that list. Inspecting your home for radon and installing a radon mitigation system as needed, I think, is a very wise thing to do. Tossing household chemicals for botanical alternatives. These are things that can be great. And unfortunately, with water damage and mold, we're going to need quite more slides. There's a lot there to take in. When we talk about water damage, this creates the groundwork for mold and bacteria. Mold and bacteria are pretty insidious as they constantly reproduce. They sporulate. Mold, on example, is typically between 2 and 4 microns, or roughly 25 to 50 times smaller than what the eye can see. So yes, when you see it on a wall, there's already a lot there colonized. Bacteria can be between 0.2 and 2 microns in size. Mycotoxins, which are toxins produced by certain species of mold, are approximately 0.1 micron. Why does this matter? Well, according to the American Lung Association, anything smaller than 10 microns poses the greatest health risk to humans, just because it bypasses our self-defense mechanisms, entering our bloodstream, which, that's where the problems really start to take shape. What is mold? I think just clearing this up might be helpful for some. The word mold means many things, which I think causes a lot of confusion. Mold is one of 3 types of fungi, mushrooms, yeast. Mold is also 100,000 different species that we know of. A mold is both a living multicellular organism that reproduces asexually by spores, and it's typically referred to as the spore itself. Why that matters a great deal is because when you're talking about removing mold from the home, or when you're talking about, reducing the amount of exposure inside of a home, you have to look at, well, we have the source, which would be, the water intrusion that's allowing the mold to grow in the first place, coupled with the living organism that's growing behind the wall or growing behind the ceiling or around that window. And you also have the byproducts that organism creates, like the spores and the toxins that then infiltrate the home and spread across the home. There may be 100,000 species of mold, but we cannot test for all of them. Most of the studies that we see regarding mold are done on only 36 different species. These were the species that the EPA chose for their studies, both in 2006 and 2019. Mold can grow in as quickly as 24 to 48 hours. Obviously, the longer it grows, usually the larger the colony will grow. There's a lot of variables, how much moisture is present as well. But it's good to know that it can grow in as little as 20, 40, 48 hours. It's not like it has to be leaking for 10 years. Certain species of mold, like Aspergillus, only require 60% relative humidity to grow. Certain species like Stachybotrys or Cotomium typically take about 3 to 5 days of moisture to grow. Mildew is really just a nice way of saying mold. When people refer to mildew, they're usually referring to either Aspergillus or Penicillium, a lighter species in color. Mildew itself really refers to powdery mildew, which is a plant fungus. It's from the Ascomycota kingdom. Aspergillus is also from the Ascomycota kingdom. So it's just a nice way of saying I have a certain species of mold in my house. Bleach does not effectively remove mold. For many, many years, we thought it did, unfortunately. This is from a societal standpoint, but if you go on the EPA's website right now and Google and type in bleach, you'll see that bleach and also things like bleach that aim at killing mold might not be so good to use, because even dead mold can cause an allergic reaction in some. To remove mold, you really need to remove its roots as well. Mold is like a plant, a poisonous one. It has roots that root into building materials. It has seeds, which are called spores, and it can create toxins. It doesn't always create toxins. It's a self-defense mechanism. So I think it has to feel threatened, usually by other species of mold fighting for the same real estate. But we always want to look at toxin-producing molds inside of a home when we're trying to understand the health of the home and how to create a healthier home. Mycotoxins are fungal toxins produced by certain species of mold. it's literally like chemical warfare typically going on behind your walls. You might have Aspergillus penicillioids, you might have Stachybotrys, and they're producing mycotoxins to literally kill each other, to take over the real estate of water that's inside your walls. We also have, the modern home has a less volume of air inside of our homes than outside, which does increase particles and toxins for each breath that we take. The main reason I harp on 20,000 breaths per day is really this fact of we're consuming almost enough air to fill up a normal size swimming pool. Within that air, we are obviously inhaling tons of particles, toxins, chemicals, you name it. So in all of this is aimed around how do we understand what we're breathing and how do we reduce the amount of particles, toxins, mold, et cetera, that we are in fact breathing. With the modern building, we don't have as much air exchange as we once used to, and that's a big part of energy efficiency. And so in these newer homes, a lot of people are having to retrofit, install things like ERV systems to bring fresh air in from outside. So again, we're diluting the amount of particles that are entering our body with each breath. And, as you know, I did mention that quite a bit. Bacteria in our health, bacteria is an evolving thing that you're seeing more and more of in the scientific and medical communities, especially actinobacteria in our homes. Actinobacteria are gram-positive bacteria that often accompany mold and water damage inside of our homes. Many of the studies I've seen on actinobacteria are tested in our drain lines, especially like HVAC condensation drain lines, boiler drain lines, et cetera. And, we're still trying to understand the breadth of how actinobacteria plays a role in our homes, in our health, and in water damage. These are some of the sources we know about today. Right? So it's water damage that intrudes from outside. If the water passes through, soil or other biological contaminants on the way in, people could have, let's say, rats in their attic or bats in their attic. You can have water damage and carry through biological contaminants into the home. PVC drains, as I mentioned, actinobacteria is abundant in the soil. It can get tracked in from pets, tracked in from wearing shoes in the home. So if you're looking at these things, you want to try to clean your pets off when they go and play outside in the yard, take your shoes off. Our drain lines really should be cleaned once a year. A lot of us don't clean them until they have a clog, and then we have a problem where we have to be a little more proactive. Every drain line will have a P trap where water can, kind of sit there. And if you don't use it a lot, you can accumulate things like mold and bacteria in there. Size of actinobacteria between 2 and 50 microns, with 10 microns being the most
See the slide.
abundance. Actinobacteria reproduces asexually through spores like mold.
Make it in, yeah.
And did I mention we take 20,000 breaths per day? Common symptoms of living in water damage. This is not a complete list by any means, but just to give you some of the more common ones you hear about. This is brain fog, chronic fatigue, headaches, inflammation, gut issues, skin issues, respiratory issues, trouble breathing, night sweats, night terrors, insomnia, cognitive impairment, fertility issues, mental health issues, mold rage, and more. These are just a few of the highlights of common symptoms. Like all illnesses, it's going to show up differently in everyone. There are so many unanswered questions as to everything that we can experience with mold and bacteria and how that relates to our health. But one thing that I know is, everybody seems to improve their symptoms when they put air quality on their radar and take steps to improve it. Because mold is such an insidious problem inside of people's homes, I want to spend quite a few slides on mold itself and what I've seen over the past 12 years since I've been in the field looking at people's homes, helping people fix their homes. And this is kind of the process of where I think needs to shift from to, and I'll explain why. Mold can be hidden like behind a wall and you have no idea hidden. Gwyneth Paltrow was a client of mine. She had mold underneath her bathtub. So, for example, when you looked at the bathtub, when you looked at the floor, you didn't really see anything. And it wasn't until we got some people in to do moisture mapping and some testing, we identified a strand of mold called Chitomium that was underneath her bathtub. And once you actually remove the bathtub, you can see it was all underneath the bathtub. It was literally on the back side of it, but it was also growing into the floor underneath that. So that all had to come up, and we came up with some better design choices, like putting stone underneath that instead of wood floor. But the point that I'm making here in this case is you don't necessarily have to see it. A lot of people think this has to be creeping all up your walls and be very obvious for you to have a problem. And I want to, unfortunately tell you that's not the case. How people usually detect mold since the invention of what's called the aerocassette. Basically, I'm being facetious here, as you can see, but you call somebody, they come in, they take an air sample in the center of your home. They're typically telling you how nice your home is, and they're going to say, good news, your home is perfect. And, imagine going to the doctor and just checking one vitamin or mineral as an entire health screen. It almost makes sense that if I have poor air quality, then an air test would tell me that. But we have to kind of take into consideration air transmission. Now, many of us have heard the terminology air transmission all throughout COVID. Particles typically travel somewhere between 3 and 6 feet from the source point. Mold is no different than that. And mold is very light. It typically attaches to other particles that are already in the air. If you've ever sat near a window on a sunny day and you've seen how much dust is in the air, you know what I mean. Our dust is everywhere. Mold attaches to it, hitches a ride on the dust. When it's already attached to the dust, it's too big to fit inside this cassette, so it's not going to be measured. You're really talking about isolated spores within the area. So I want to break this down and really drive this point home, because I think it's important. A lot of people miss things because they follow this step incorrectly. Now, if we just said that it's going to travel 3-6 feet, I want you to think about the center of your room or the center of your house. You're not very likely to have a problem in the center. You're likely to have a problem either on an exterior wall because water's coming in from outside, or an interior plumbing wall where there might be a plumbing leak. And that's probably going to be, in the average size home, 5 to 6 feet away from where they would actually test in the center of the room. So it's not a very good screening tool, unfortunately. And that's how so much is missed when these guys come in and just take a simple test. Our houses, our buildings, we have pressure changes. When HVAC turns on, we're redistributing things. When we open doors and windows, we do have air movement. And so, unfortunately, just because you have mold in your bathroom, let's say, doesn't mean that you are not going to experience or inhale these particles when you're in another room across the house. So just like we screen our bodies at the doctor, we want to screen our homes. Our dust is like the blood of our home. It carries the DNA of what's in it. The dust test utilizes PCR technology. So I helped develop a test called the dust test. There's another test called ERMI, which some of you might be more familiar with. It's really the same thing. It just doesn't have the ERMI score, because we don't want to pay attention to the score. We want to pay attention to the data. But you can buy an ERMI, get the same information. What we're looking for is abnormalities in mold, the toxins for mold, bacteria, toxins for bacteria, essentially the byproducts of water damage. What we're trying to understand when we test these issues in our home is, how abnormal is this? And so if I see Stachybotrys, for example, a toxigenic species of mold that I know can wipe people out with even just one spore detected, we're going to take it a lot more seriously than if we see, a slightly elevated amount of Aspergillus penicilliaris, for example. So Just like when we screen our bodies and we're looking for things out of balance, same thing. We screen our homes, we're looking for things out of balance, and then we do deeper dives from there. So this is kind of like the step one that I usually like to see, or if I'm working with somebody, what I'm recommending. This is just a little slide that kind of tells you the difference of the tests out there and how they differ from each other, where they have pros and cons. So if I'm doing air testing, I'm doing this as a step 2 after I do a screen to try to understand. Once I know that I have abnormal sources of, let's say, Stachybotrys or whatever, I now want to know where that's coming from, right? So now I might do targeted air testing, like actually inside of a wall cavity, or surface testing to try to figure out where this Stachybotrys might be coming from, right? So there are benefits to it, but they're not good as a screening tool, and that's how they're typically used incorrectly. So we find mold and bacteria, now what, right? So we've got really a 4-step process here. And unfortunately, so many people follow these 4 steps incorrectly, or they get bad advice when they follow these 4 steps. The step 1 is we want to identify the sources creating these particles and toxins. There has to be a fundamental problem with something in the house that would allow mold or bacteria to grow in the first place, especially if we're dealing with water damage. This could be leaking windows, could be a leaking roof, could be the HVAC system was improperly installed and it's condensating or it's leaking. Could be, the bathroom wasn't waterproof properly, and every time you take a shower, that water seeps through and gets into the wall cavity. Could be many different things, right? The key element here, though, is we need to figure out what are those things. How do we make sure that they don't continue to exist? Because otherwise, trying to fix the house without doing this is kind of like trying to stop an overflowing bathtub by throwing towels on the floor without shutting off the faucet first, right? We have to shut off the faucet. So this step is very important. We want to then remove, not kill, just remove the sources of mold and bacteria. And that might be, I might have to open up some drywall. I might have to remove some insulation. I might find, wood beams behind there where I have to physically scrub them and remove the mold growing into the lumber. I might use some botanical products, might even use something as simple as soap and water just to clean the area thoroughly, remove any of these particles, toxins, byproducts, etc. But one thing is for sure, I want to remove these things. I don't want to rely on chemicals and products and fogging and all these other things because they are not effective if you're not physically removing the material growing inside your walls, ceilings, etc. Just to give you an example of this, if you had a dirty kitchen countertop, you had particles all over the place, you're not just going to spray something and walk away, you're going to wipe it down, right? So we have to remove particles from our environment. We can't just spray stuff to get rid of them. Step 3, we want to clean the HVAC. This is the lungs of our home. I have yet to see a home that didn't have a mold problem, didn't also have mold growing in the HVAC, mainly because the HVAC has an evaporator coil. The evaporator coil is the part of the machine that constantly condensates. It takes the humidity out of the air, which is a really important thing that it does. It's the reason we have drip pans underneath the HVAC machine to take that water away and bring it outside. And unfortunately, because it constantly condensates, it's a very vulnerable spot for something like mold or bacteria to start to develop and grow on that coil. But we have to clean it. Now, if I do this out of sequence, right, if I clean the HVAC first, this is just all I do, and I still have sources producing particles and toxins, right, that HVAC system is just going to get recontaminated. So it's important to do this really as a step 3. Step 4, cleaning the entire home. Now, I get asked this question a lot. Why clean the HVAC first, not the home? And that's because the HVAC, unfortunately, no HVAC system is what's called hermetically sealed. Matter of fact, the average rate that they go for is about 96, 97%. So meaning you have some spillage of particles, no matter how well the system's cleaned, coming back into the environment. So you would want to clean your HVAC system, let's just say on a Friday. Saturday, I have, set up to the entire house to be cleaned. And that's kind of how I would do that process. You kind of do it like a Congo line. The 2 main objectives: remove the organism, remove the particles and toxins created by the organism. This is the only two objectives. Everything else is a marketing term. This is what we want to accomplish. Simplicity. Mold and bacteria from water damage events are filamentous and root into building materials, right? So just like what happens if you don't remove the roots of a weed, comes back. You also have to take into consideration there's something wrong allowing for the opportunity for mold and bacteria. That has to be corrected or it just keeps coming back. When mold or bacteria feel threatened, they produce toxins, right? Mentioned that chemical warfare. The average water damage event takes a professional 3 to 5 days to properly dry out with professional equipment. So something to keep in mind, because we talked about some molds can grow faster than others. Some take 3 to 5 days. Well, it does take 3 to 5 days to dry out. So that's why I think opening things up and allowing things to dry faster is always a good approach. With water damage, the key here is we've all experienced water damage in our lives before. The odds are, it's statistically speaking, 1 out of every 10 years, we will deal with a water damage event, big or small. You always want to remove the wet building materials following the path the water has traveled. I understand sometimes they're expensive, like a wood floor. You could have wood panel on the walls. If it's me, I'm removing all the wet building materials. It doesn't matter, because I know that if I don't, there's a real good chance, because there might be too many layers touching each other, I'm going to have trapped moisture and it is not going to dry quick enough to prevent mold growth. And the ugly part is what it all costs, right? I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard a story or two about this. Good air quality renovations with no gimmicks are a renovation, right? You have to renovate your property, and it's going to cost the average cost of a renovation. Some homes are going to need more renovations than others. Homeowners insurance can be helpful if you have the proper coverage, and it can be tied to what is considered a covered loss. Not everybody has the proper coverage. Some people don't have mold coverage at all. Some people have a limit of maybe 10,000. A covered loss, water seepage from the outside in typically isn't a covered loss, whereas a pipe breaks and leaks, that would be a covered loss. Storm damage would be a covered loss. It gets very confusing. You almost always need to read your policy and get an understanding of what you're covered for and what you're not. Because not everybody has money trees in their backyard, right? The common questions I get asked is, what can we do when we cannot renovate? And, these are kind of the list of budget-friendly IAQ hacks here. Sticking through that particles and toxins accumulate in the dust, regular wet wiping of the surfaces to reduce exposure to contaminants. That's something that can be done. I mean, it is essentially like what I said before. You have an overflowing bathtub, you're putting towels down, but if you don't have any options and you need to, do something in the interim, this is something that you would want to do. Wet wiping over vacuuming, mainly because the vacuumings with HEPA filters getting down to maybe 3 microns, you still have the potential to allow those particles to pass through the filter, get back into the environment. I find wet wiping to be much more effective in that, reducing the likelihood of aerosolization, not having to worry about where to vent the vacuums and deal with that, just to, again, reduce the overall amount of dust and contaminants in that dust. Air purification helps remove dust, helps remove contaminants as they become aerosolized, helps reduce the frequency of cleaning. The key here is find a device that removes the smallest particle possible at the highest frequency possible, at the highest efficiency. And that's really the key. All the bells and whistles and the Wi-Fi, this and that, they're really not that important. Again, it's all air purifiers are a vacuum and a filter. So it's really the filter that you want to consider. Choose an air purifier, again, that can remove the smallest particle possible. HVAC filtration. Consider upgrading your HVAC filtration to remove smaller particles entering your HVAC. We talked about how it's vulnerable, right? It condensates. So if you can stop particles from getting to the unit where it condensates and prevent it from growing, mold and bacteria, I think it's a wise investment. Cleaning the HVAC first, then the home, as we talked about. That's another thing. So if you are, you can't renovate, you have mold in the HVAC. We know we have, we've done an ERMI, we've done a dust test. We know we've got mold in the dust. We want to try to clean the HVAC first, clean the house first, second, and then from there, it does make a difference. Maintaining humidity levels between 40 and 50% is another thing that you can do to prevent mold from growing. If there's too much relative humidity, you're giving it the moisture it needs to survive. Change the Air, a little bit about Change the Air. I am the chairman of Change the Air Foundation. I'm the co-founder of it. We focus on really education and awareness, policy reform, and research. One of the really cool things about a research project that is about to come out is understanding the economic impacts of water damage in buildings across North America is really important. I think for policy reform, it's really important to show different state legislators and the federal government that, of course, this is actually costing us more money to ignore than it is to actually go in and fix. And we should have that going hopefully in June. We're working with a firm that we have partnered with to do this study with, and we're getting real close to being able to issue that to the public. We're very excited about, and of course, policy reform. I mean, the way we build homes, maintain homes, restore homes, it is a problem. It is not built with air quality in mind, and it is something that really needs to change. And unfortunately, we do need policy reform to get there. So if anything of that sounded exciting to you, please visit changetheairfoundation.org. And then just a little bit about me. I'm a certified microbial remediation supervisor from the ACAC. Requires 10 years of experience, highest certification you can get in my field. Authored a book that was released in 2020 called The Mold Medic, an Expert's Guide on Mold Removal. That book is no longer available. Excitingly enough, we are working on our second book that hopefully will be out by the end of this year. And everything, all the content has been modernized, updated, and very excited to get that out to you guys. More information about me, websites listed there.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation, Michael.
Yes.
It's an honor to hear your talk. I found your advice on looking everywhere very important. And also I'm looking now for an HVAC cleaning company as you speak. No, there were many good questions from our survey that we put forward, some which you were able to answer during your talk. I have a few of the questions from the survey, and then we had some good ones from the audience too. So one of the questions is, I think people were asking, what does household mold look like? And can you differentiate between like a good non-toxic mold or a toxic mold without a professional testing? So I'll ask that.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can see it. And if I see mold on a wall, do I necessarily need to test it to understand, or can I take action to get rid of it? You wouldn't need to test it at that point. Unfortunately, most mold problems that I see in people's homes are actually the hidden problems. It's actually the stuff they don't know about. And even under sink cabinets, we can get some interesting signs. You could see it starts out as a water stain. You do a surface test of the water stain. You would never believe sometimes that it comes back as high as it does, which then says, all right, this isn't just a water stain. We got to take the cabinet out. And then you take the cabinet out, right? And then it's behind the cabinet. You've got black mold, right? And so sometimes it's these little signs that you see that become the tip of the iceberg. And that's where I think testing helps guide us. How far do we need to go? Obviously tests cost money, but it also costs money to start to remove things and start to renovate things, especially doing it properly. And my concern is, where should we spend time, money, and resources on making an impact to the quality of air that we're breathing? I think it's hard to do that without testing.
Thank you so much for that answer. One of the questions also was, what could help with improving air quality? Do air purifiers work? And I know you had the word ionic, so maybe you don't like that, but there's this whole drive now for ionic air purifiers as I look at one in my daughter's room. So there is that question too. If they do, are they helpful?
Yeah, I mean, as you saw in my presentation, I do believe that they are helpful. I do believe they help reduce the amount of dust in the air. Obviously, some of them are going to be better than others. Some of them can remove something as small as mold. Some of them can't, right? And so it's really comes down to what unit do you have? What sort of particle can it remove? Again, I try to stay away from these marketing terms like I destroy mold, I kill it, and then stop it dead in its tracks. And if it's not just trapping it in the filter and then getting changed out with filter changes, I think it's trying to do something that isn't proven at this point. The second thing about the air purification conversation is very important. If I have problems producing particles in my home, I want to understand where the source of those particles are actually emanating from, so I can then clean that up properly and reduce the overall amount of particles that my home is essentially generating. So if I do that strategy and put air purifiers in, now I've got a good strategy going. If I can't afford to find where the sources are, if I can't afford to fix the sources, of course, I would use anything that I possibly could to get me some relief. But I think it's really the power of looking at it from, we filter our water, we should filter our air, but we should also, if we can, try to limit the amount of particles that our home creates and look at it from that perspective. If we're trying to achieve a few things at once, we're going to have a good outcome. I
Sorry,
think you just
yes,
muted.
I am muted. I just realized that, and our helpful person here could let me know. So you touched upon insurance, and one question that came in was, are landlords required to remediate mold if you're renting? If you're familiar with that.
Yeah. So, well, there are 50 states. Each state has its own specific real estate laws. I would argue that all landlords should be required to do something about it. But there are a lot of different nuances between the lease agreement that you signed, the state in which you live, and really what laws they're being held to. And from there, it's also what attorney might be willing to write you a letter, or if it even has to go that far, take your case to get you out of the lease or get reparations for being in a bad spot. It's just tough. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Change the Air Foundation is get policy reform, right? Get better protections in place. And I want to be clear, I don't want to paint landlords as the biggest problem here. One thing I think people would find interesting is that if I owned a second home, and anyone living in a building owned by somebody else, this is a second home for them. They don't get insurance coverage for mold. Insurance companies do not provide landlords mold coverage whatsoever. And so that, it kind of puts investors in a bad position to not be able to have the resources they need to fix problems when they are created. So we've really got to look at the entirety of the American system here and make some tweaks. And that would include having proper insurance coverage for everyone, having some better disclosures in real estate, and better protections for people, whether they own the house, rent the house, etc.
Thank you so much. That'd be wonderful to get that overall insurance. So if another question that came in is, one concern is that when you're removing mold, let's say even with not bleach, but if it requires other chemicals, what do you do for people that have chemical sensitivities?
Yeah. So for me, I don't use any chemicals. I don't think you need to use chemicals to remediate. Unfortunately, there are 50,000 companies out there that do remediation, and Everybody has their own products that they are exposed to, products they like to use. And really, there are plenty of chemical-based products out on the marketplace still today. I use botanical products, or I'll use even soap and water, if need be, depending on the person's sensitivity level. There's tons of different botanical products, more entering the marketplace all the time. And so I think, I personally have worked with people with chemical sensitivities since about 2013. So I know exactly what you mean and where you're coming from. And I think luckily where we are today in 2024, it's just not needed to use chemicals.
That sounds very hopeful for, people with chemical sensitivities. I know there's many questions that came in as far as symptoms and maybe more health related issues, but I'll try to focus more on, the mold remediation and that aspect of your talk. So another question that came in is if clothes can bring in mold from the outdoors. You mentioned a lot of, water damage, but can you remove mold through on clothes through just washing, for instance, or would they need to be thrown away? Is there that possibility, or are you introducing it to the water system?
Um, so what I do want to say here is I think we don't want to get into a situation where we're fearful to leave our houses, or we think we have to build a bubble around our houses in order to survive and thrive. The reality of it is you're going to go to the grocery store. The grocery store might have some mold. You're going to go to a friend's house. You're going to go to a family's houses. You can't control what they have. I use what's called EC3 laundry additive at my house. So it's something that we add with our detergent. It's supposed to 99% of the time remove mold and mycotoxins. And that's what I do. I use air purifiers. I clean my house regularly, and I make sure that there's no water damage. So, there's a lot of different variables here to touch on. Some people might have allergic reactions. Some people might be dealing with a sensitivity to mold specifically. And there's a lot of challenges there. When it comes to just every day worried about mold growing in our house because we go somewhere and bring it in some, that is something I want to promise you and tell you that it's not exactly how it works. Your house has to have problems before mold from the grocery store coming into your house is going to all of a sudden make a massive mold problem in your house. And so there's a lot of variables and a lot of nuances there, and I'm happy to go further. But I just want people to understand we can't be worried about building bubbles around our houses or never living any sort of normal life.
That's a very good point too to think about, and to sort of think more of the house and what you can do structurally. It's hard to confront the environment, right?
Yeah.
So one other question, which came from the audience, was how would one assess a new home they're considering renting or buying? How would they know if it really has good air quality? You do hear of people buying houses and then unfortunately discovering, there's mold in them.
Yeah. It's happened to quite a few people over the years, unfortunately. But one couple that comes to mind was a very young couple. It was like their first house. The home inspector did his normal home inspection, found the usual, this hot water heater has probably only got a year or two left, right? Didn't really find anything remarkable. And even the basement visually looked fine, but the second they tried to move in, they started not feeling well. And we found pretty much black mold growing behind the drywall in the basement where the cement was and the insulation was. And it all had to be gutted. Right. And unfortunately, like most people buying a house, you buy what you can afford. And we don't take these things into consideration when we're buying a house because, they're supposed to be turnkey and ready to go. And sometimes this isn't the case, right? So what I would say is when you get a home inspection, I would also maybe consider looking for a reputable mold inspector to go side by side, because the home inspector is usually not thorough in that regard from a water damage and mold perspective. They may point some things out here or there, but they're not usually equipped to do the proper air quality testing that you might care about. And I think that's a big important thing. The other thing I try to tell people is, if you look at the US EPA HUD data from 2006, 2019, 35 of the 36 mold species that they tested for went up in prevalence over those years. It tells us that, unfortunately, mold is becoming more common in people's homes than they used to be, right? And it seems to, again, traverse with the theory here that homes are getting tighter, they're getting built, they're getting built differently than they used to be built. We're having more water intrusion. We haven't been maintaining them and restoring them properly. When we take that into consideration, certain species of mold, when you look at that prevalence chart, you're talking 90% prevalence. It's like, where do you go, right? What I think we need to reframe from a societal standpoint is, instead of buying a house at the top of our budget, have a little wiggle room so that if we like the house, we love the location, we think it has good bones, we're willing to fix some things, and I think that's kind of how we need to, in my opinion, reframe the whole buying and selling process. And we have to get educated and advocate for ourselves, because it's right now it's not really happening.
Thank you for that answer. So similar vein, what can you do when you're traveling? What are some pointers on how to control or adapt the environment to make sure it's as mold free as possible?
Well, when traveling, stay away from Airbnbs. The best thing best advice I give. I mean, Airbnb is like rolling a crapshoot here, because we'll put it this way: I've done some filming at about 3 Airbnbs so far, and we actually use them to film problems that we find to educate people on mold and water damage. And because you usually you will find at least something. Unfortunately, it's a big market where a ton of new investors entered into. When I say new investors, I mean, people that, again, this is their first investment property. They don't really know much about construction, restoration, or the home space itself. And they're, looking to expand their financial portfolio and earn some cash. And the result of that is you've had a bunch of, flipping people, kind of like the HGTV show, that have come in and renovated these things specifically for those investors. A lot of them have not been renovated well at all, unfortunately. So just be careful with Airbnbs. That's the one thing I want to say. Hopefully one day we have like a healthier version of that. And when you're going into hotel rooms, I would bring in some disinfectant that you use. Like I said, there's tons of botanical disinfectants out there. Clean the place thoroughly. There might be some travel air purifiers that you might like. Some of them are small enough and compact enough to fit into a suitcase. You could bring those in, and pay attention to the HVAC system inside the hotel room. Sometimes there are mini splits through the wall. Look at the fan blades, look at the coil. You can kind of peek through and see it. If you see mold growth in there, you can ask to change the room. Look at the bathroom, look at the vent fans, just kind of be a little more observant than you might normally. And you might be surprised at what you find. And do not be ashamed to go downstairs and say, hey, look, this room's not going to work for me. I found some troubling spots. I'd like to be moved to a new room.
Those are very good points to think of when you're, going to a hotel. Thank you for that. So I'll ask, it's almost 5, but I have 2 last questions for you. The first one is, you've mentioned again, water damage, but do molds come back in a dry environment?
Well, mold spores will naturally come into the environment, even if it's dry, just because you are going to have some mold in our ecosystem. However, if your environment is dry, there shouldn't be opportunistic growth of said spores. So I'll give you a really good example. So let's just say I live in the middle of a desert in Arizona. I'm still going to have some types of molds enter into the house. It's going to happen, right? Because I'm going to travel. I'm going to go to grocery stores, go to friends' houses. I'm going to bring mold back with me. If it's dry, if there's no moisture problems inside the home, right, that mold is going to pretty much just naturally get removed from the environment as I'm cleaning and air purifying and doing all these things. And it's not going to start to grow into a massive mold problem because there's not water in the environment. But, and I want to be clear about the question that you're asking itself, because I think that's important. If you just, let's say you have mold growing in a window and you just fix the window leak and you don't actually do anything to remove the mold, that mold is going to stay there and it's going to go dormant. It may produce less, but it's still going to be there. I have seen walls get opened up and mold growing behind a wall underneath a window that was fixed 10 years ago. And the water would stop, but the mold was still there. We were still able to pick it up with a test, right? So it's important to understand that just getting rid of the water doesn't actually solve the problem fully, but it is a very important part of that, solving the problem.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that it might be invisible, almost with the repair from the water damage. So one last question. You've also mentioned bacteria. One question was, what share of houses that you inspect end up testing positive for mold or mold and bacteria?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
So when you're inspecting houses, what is, what share of houses have mostly mold, or do they have mold and bacteria? Is that something you can predict that will be with the mold as well?
Oh, I mean, it's almost synonymous with each other because if I have mold, I will also have bacteria. I Mold is one of the easier things to detect because of the technology. We have far more instruments that can help us find mold. They both are going to grow in the same water locations. They both require a good bit of water to grow. So I would say if you have mold, you could probably as safely assume that you have some bacteria present. If you have bacteria present, probably safe to assume you have some mold present as well. I've never seen a house that just had actinobacteria and no mold, or just had mold, no actinobacteria. The only thing that I could see being a possibility from that standpoint would be if they fully removed all the mold, clean the house real well, but they didn't, clean the drains or clean some of the other sources of where actinobacteria might be prevalent. That's the only thing I would see.
All right, thank you so much. This has been most informative and something very much close to a lot of the patients that have ME/CFS, to avoid any further, infections and have a healthy environment. We are having Dr. Jill Krista in September. You're welcome to join too, that she will be answering some more of these more medically related questions. So we'll hold on to those. So thank you again so much for joining us. Let's see. So as a reminder, this recording will be posted on the MassME site, the YouTube channel. You'll get an email when the recording is up. Please share the video with your family and friends on social media. And then we'd like to bring your attention to a very exciting opportunity. Please join Team MassME, yay, at the Fun K Run Walk Roll. This will be held at the Boston Waterfront 5K race on June 8th. The QR code will bring you a link to register. This is our big 40th anniversary fundraiser. Please also consider to share this event on social media or come cheer us on. Our next Sunday Conversations event is May 19th, which is again the third Sunday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We are honored to have Dr. Maitland join us, who will be discussing mast cell activation syndrome. Finally, if you found this program worthwhile, there are a few ways you can help. You can make a donation to help support these wonderful series by donating online at this website. massmecfs.org/donate. On the same page, you can sign up for the MassME newsletter. And if you donate $25 or more and check the option, become a member, that will establish your membership or renew it. And you will be invited to our members only programs. Thank you again all for coming. Thank you, Michael, for your wonderful presentation. As a researcher, I can't wait to hear about all these fantastic studies you're doing. We hope again to see everyone next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.